I buried my older brother at noon, and by 3 o'clock, I was standing in my own foyer listening to a man who lived rent-free under my roof pour my best scotch for people I did not know. My name is Andre Davis. I am 63 years old. I've worked as a master carpenter in Atlanta for 4 decades, and I've built my life on respect. But right now, there was no respect in my house. The bass from the music vibrated through the floorboards. The floorboards I had laid myself over a weekend 10 years ago. I stood there in my dark suit, the collar still stiff, the smell of the cemetery dirt still clinging to my shoes. I had driven straight home from the repast, hoping for quiet. Instead, I found a fleet of leased luxury cars parked on my grass. I walked down the hallway toward the living room. The air was thick with expensive cologne and the loud, obnoxious laughter of men who talk too much but say nothing. Jamal Carter. My son-in-law was holding court by the fireplace. He was wearing a custom suit, holding a crystal glass and playing the role of the self-made king. "Look at the crown molding on the ceiling," Jamal said, pointing upward with his drink. "I had it done last year. You have to invest in the details, gentlemen." I stopped in the doorway. I had cut and installed that molding myself when my daughter Brenda was still in high school. Jamal had never held a hammer in his life. He had been living with me for 4 years, ever since his supposed startup hit a rough patch. That rough patch had turned into a permanent vacation in my guest suite. One of the slick-looking men in a gray suit laughed and clapped Jamal on the shoulder. "You are living the dream, Jamal. This estate is incredible. Southside real estate is booming, and you are sitting on a gold mine." Jamal smiled, a wide, arrogant smile. "It is all about vision," he said, taking a sip of my 30-year-old scotch. "You have to know what a property is worth, and you have to be willing to take it to the next level. I'm thinking about expanding the back deck, maybe putting in a pool next spring." He did not own the deck. He did not own the grass where he wanted to put the pool. He did not even own the glass he was drinking from. I watched him lie to these men he was desperately trying to impress for some new business venture, and I felt a cold, hard knot form in my chest. I did not yell. Yelling is for people who have lost control. I stepped fully into the room. A few of the guests noticed me. The conversation started to die down, trailing off into an awkward silence. Jamal turned around, and his smile freezing for a fraction of a second before he forced it back onto his face. Andre Jamal said, his voice overly loud, dripping with a fake hearty warmth. "You are back early. Gentlemen, this is Andre, my father-in-law. He is staying with us for a bit." Staying with him. In the house I owned outright. The man in the gray suit nodded at me, completely unaware. "Nice to meet you, Andre. Jamal has a beautiful home here." I looked at the man. Then I looked at Jamal. Jamal swallowed hard, his eyes silently begging me to play along to protect his fragile ego in front of his investors. I did not say a word to the man in the gray suit. I just stared at Jamal, letting the silence stretch out, letting it become heavy and uncomfortable. The music kept playing, but nobody was listening anymore. Jamal shifted his weight, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly on the hardwood. I looked at the bottle of scotch on the table. Then I looked back at Jamal. I did not need to raise my voice. The quiet was loud enough. "I'm going to the backyard," I said, my voice low and even. I turned around and walked back down the hallway. I did not look back. I needed air. I needed the sanctuary of my workshop. The only place where things made sense, where raw materials were shaped by honest work. But as I walked out the back door and stepped down onto the patio, I did not know that the disrespect was just beginning. The Georgia air was thick and humid, pressing down on my shoulders as I crossed the patio. I needed the smell of sawdust and the quiet weight of my tools. My workshop sat at the edge of the property, tucked under the shade of 2 massive oak trees. I built that shop from the ground up, pouring the concrete foundation myself 20 years ago. It was my church, the place where I went to think, and the place where I healed after my wife passed away. I walked across the lawn, loosening my tie, trying to push the noise of the party out of my head. But as I got closer to the heavy wooden double doors, I stopped cold. The latch was drawn, and locked through the heavy steel ring was a thick silver padlock. It was not my lock. I never locked the shop. I stepped closer, my heart starting to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I looked down, and my breath caught in my throat. There, piled in the damp Georgia mud, was my life, my tools. The heavy cast iron hand planes that I had spent months restoring were dumped carelessly onto the wet grass. My chisels, the set my father gave me when I turned 21, were scattered like trash. My custom drill press was leaning sideways against a muddy wheelbarrow. They were just sitting there, exposed to the moisture soaking up the dampness of the earth. What is going on here? I whispered to myself. Before I could process the destruction, the back door of the house swung open. Loud voices spilled out into the yard. Jamal was walking toward me, leading his pack of men in expensive suits. They held fresh drinks, laughing at some joke Jamal had just told. Jamal saw me standing by the locked doors. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward like a tour guide showing off an estate. "Ah, here's the space I was telling you about," Jamal said, waving his hand toward my workshop. "It is a bit of an eyesore right now, but the footprint is perfect. I'm converting it into a detached executive home office." One of the men, a tall guy with a receding hairline, pointed at my tools in the dirt. "Looks like you had to clear out some junk," he said, laughing a little. Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, the old man here likes to tinker. It is cute, but we needed to make room for some actual business. You know how it is, gentlemen. Hobbies are fine, but you cannot let them stand in the way of progress." I looked at Jamal, staring right into his eyes. He smiled back, but his eyes were hard, daring me to challenge him in front of his audience. He thought my grief made me weak. He thought the suit I was wearing, the one I just buried my brother in, made me tired enough to roll over. "Jamal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Open this door." Jamal let out a loud, theatrical sigh, turning to his friends. "See what I mean, guys? Set in his ways." He turned back to me, adopting a patronizing tone like he was talking to a confused child. "Andre, we talked about this. Well, Brenda and I talked about this. That space is just sitting there gathering dust. I need a quiet place to take my conference calls and host potential clients." "You threw my tools in the mud," I said, pointing at the scattered iron and wood. "You locked my doors." Jamal rolled his eyes. "I moved them outside so the contractors could get in here tomorrow morning to tear out the drywall. Do not worry, Andre. I will buy you a nice little toolbox for the garage. You can still play with your wood scraps in there." The guests chuckled again. They looked at me with pity, seeing an obsolete old man standing in the way of a young visionary. They had no idea who they were laughing at. Jamal stepped closer to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Do not make a scene in front of my investors, old man. This is my house now. Go inside and take a nap." He patted me on the shoulder. He actually patted my shoulder. I looked down at his hand resting on the dark fabric of my suit. Then I looked at my tools, rusting in the damp soil. I did not raise my hand. I did not scream. I did not give him the satisfaction of an outburst. I just stepped back, letting his hand fall away. "You are right," I said quietly. "I am going to go inside." Jamal smirked, turning back to his guests, victorious. "Let us go check out the wine cellar, gentlemen," he said, leading them away. I stood there for another moment. I memorized the sight of my father's chisels in the mud. Then I turned around. I walked away from the workshop, away from the mud and the laughter. I did not go back inside the house. I walked around the side of the garage, past the line of expensive leased cars, sitting on my grass. I kept walking until I reached the driveway where my old dark green Chevy truck was parked. It was a humble truck, a worker's truck. Jamal always joked about it, saying it brought down the property value. He did not know that the title to that truck was sitting in a safe deposit box right next to the deeds for half the commercial buildings on the south side of Atlanta. I unlocked the heavy metal door, pulled myself up into the cab, and slammed it shut. The thick steel cut off the sound of the bass and the arrogant voices. It was quiet in the cab. There was just the smell of old leather and the lingering scent of my brother's funeral on my suit. 4 years. I had given that boy 4 years of grace because I loved my daughter Brenda. I gave them a place to land a roof over their heads, without asking for a single dollar in rent or utilities or property taxes. I watched Jamal sleep until noon, wear custom suits he bought on credit, and talk endlessly about empires he was going to build with other people's money. I swallowed my pride and I kept my mouth shut because I wanted peace in my home. But peace is not supposed to cost you your dignity, and peace is not supposed to leave your father's tools rusting in the mud. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my phone. I scrolled past the condolence messages and found the number I needed. It was a direct line to a corner office in a glass tower downtown. The phone rang twice before a deep, calm voice answered. "Hayes here," the voice said. "It is Andre," I said, my voice steady in the quiet cab. Andre, Mr. Hayes said, a note of genuine sympathy in his tone. "I thought you were up in Fulton County putting your brother to rest. You should not be dealing with business today." "I am not dealing with business," I said, looking through the windshield toward the backyard where Jamal was showing off my property. "I am dealing with a pest problem." Mr. Hayes paused. He had been my corporate attorney for 22 years. He knew the tone of my voice and he knew exactly what it meant. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "Jamal put a padlock on my workshop door," I said. "He threw my hand planes in the dirt, and he told his friends that this house belongs to him." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Mr. Hayes knew about my workshop. He knew what those tools meant to me. "I understand," Mr. Hayes said, his voice dropping an octave, shifting from a friend to a legal executioner. "What are your instructions, Andre?" I watched the front door of my house open. 2 of Jamal's guests walked out laughing, carrying my good crystal glasses down the front steps. "The free ride is over," I said, leaning my head back against the seat. "I want every line of credit severed. I want the car leases pulled. I want the country club memberships revoked. I want every asset that boy thinks he controls frozen by sunrise." "Consider it done," Mr. Hayes said. "What about the house and the corporate holdings?" "Activate the shadow trusts," I said, my voice cold and final. "By the time he wakes up tomorrow, I want him to know exactly whose world he's living in." "I will make the calls immediately," Mr. Hayes said. "Try to get some rest tonight, Andre. Tomorrow is going to be a loud day." I hung up the phone. I looked at the dark screen for a moment. Then I started the engine of my old green truck, put it in gear, and drove away from my own house, leaving Jamal to enjoy his final night as a fake king. Jamal woke up slowly, feeling the heavy throbbing ache of expensive champagne behind his eyes. The morning sunlight cut through the thick silk curtains of the master guest suite. He rolled over in the California king bed, smiling to himself. The party had been a massive success. He had played the gracious host, pouring high-end liquor and selling the dream to 3 major real estate investors. He believed with absolute certainty that they were going to fund his new commercial development firm. Brenda was already gone, probably out running errands or visiting her father, who Jamal assumed was sulking somewhere. Jamal sat up, rubbing his face. He felt like a conqueror. He showered, taking his time under the rainfall showerhead, and stepped into his walk-in closet. He chose a light gray, custom-tailored suit, perfect for a Sunday business brunch in Buckhead. He strapped his heavy 18-karat gold Rolex to his wrist. It was a statement piece. It told the world he had arrived, even if the credit card bill for it was currently hidden in a drawer 3 months past due. He grabbed his keys and headed out the door, ready to seal the deal. The restaurant in Buckhead was loud, bright, and packed with Atlanta elite. Jamal handed his keys to the valet and strode inside, carrying himself like he owned the building. The 3 investors from the night before were already seated at a prime booth in the back. They waved him over. Jamal slid into the leather booth, signaling the waiter immediately. Bring us 2 bottles of your best vintage champagne, Jamal said, waving his hand carelessly. And we will start with the Seafood Towers, gentlemen. Today is a celebration of new beginnings. The investors chuckled, clearly enjoying the lavish treatment. For the next 2 hours, Jamal spun a beautiful web of lies. He talked about his massive portfolio leveraging the Southside estate and the upcoming demolition of his father-in-law's old useless shed. The old man just does not understand modern business, Jamal said, taking a sip of his mimosa. You have to adapt or you die. I'm transforming that property into a true executive compound. The men nodded, eating the imported oysters and drinking the expensive champagne. They talked about profit margins and zoning permits, and Jamal felt invincible. He was finally sitting at the big table. When the plates were cleared, Jamal casually raised his hand, snapping his fingers for the check. Put it all on here, Jamal said, dropping a heavy metal platinum credit card onto the leather booklet. Do not even worry about looking at it, gentlemen. This one is on the firm. The tall, thin waiter picked up the card and nodded respectfully. Jamal leaned back, crossing his legs, bathing in the admiration of his future partners. But 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. He did not look respectful anymore. He looked uncomfortable. He leaned down, placing the leather booklet back on the table right next to Jamal. Sir, the waiter said, his voice low but sharp. Your card was declined, or the conversation at the table stopped. The 3 investors looked at Jamal, their eyebrows raised. Jamal felt a sudden hot flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He forced a laugh, waving his hand as if it were a silly mistake. Fraud protection, Jamal said, shaking his head. You travel out of state one time and the bank locks everything down. Good thing I carry backups. He pulled out his soft leather wallet, his fingers moving a little faster now. He slid out a gold corporate card, handing it to the waiter. Try this one, Jamal said, keeping his smile frozen in place. The waiter walked away. Jamal tried to restart the conversation, talking about a commercial plot near the highway, but the energy at the table had shifted. The investors were quiet, sipping their water, watching him. A few minutes later, the waiter returned. This time he was accompanied by the restaurant manager, a stern-looking man in a dark suit. Mr. Carter, the manager said, standing over the booth. The second card was also declined. In fact, the terminal is displaying a code that indicates the account has been permanently closed. Jamal felt the blood drain from his face. The hot flush of embarrassment turned into a cold, sinking panic. He looked at the manager, his heart hammering against his ribs. That is impossible, Jamal said, his voice cracking slightly. Run it again. There is plenty of money in those accounts. I am the CEO of a development firm. I ran it 3 times, sir. The manager said, his tone flat and unforgiving. The bill is $1,200. Do you have another form of payment? Jamal opened his wallet. He had $40 in cash. His debit card was attached to a joint account with Brenda, which he knew was completely empty because he had drained it to buy the custom suit he was currently wearing. The 3 investors were staring at him now, their expressions turning from confused to disgusted. The illusion was shattering right in front of his eyes. I need to make a phone call, Jamal said, sliding out of the booth, his hands shaking. Just give me 1 minute. He practically ran to the front of the restaurant, pulling out his phone. He dialed the customer service number on the back of the platinum card. A robotic voice answered, informing him that the account was frozen due to the primary account holder withdrawing authorization. The primary account holder. Jamal stared at the wall. The cards were under his company name, but the underlying corporate guarantee the actual money came from a holding company. A company that Brenda told him her father had set up years ago. He never asked questions as long as the plastic worked. Jamal, a voice said behind him. He turned around. The lead investor, the man in the gray suit from last night, was standing there holding his coat. We have another meeting to get to, the man said, his voice cold and completely devoid of the warmth from an hour ago. Thank you for the drinks. We will be in touch. Jamal knew what that meant. They were never going to call him. He watched his entire future walk out the glass doors of the restaurant. The manager stepped up beside Jamal, crossing his arms. "The bill, Mr. Carter. How are we settling this? Jamal had no money. He had no working cards. He was standing in a 5-star restaurant, completely exposed as a fraud. He looked at the manager, then he looked down at his wrist. The heavy gold watch gleamed in the light. Slowly, with trembling fingers, Jamal unclasped the Rolex. He handed the warm metal to the manager. "Hold this," Jamal whispered, his voice thick with shame. "I will be back with the cash tomorrow." The manager inspected the watch, nodded slowly, and put it in his pocket. "Have a good day, sir," he said, turning his back on Jamal. Jamal walked out of the restaurant into the blinding sunlight, feeling the terrifying realization that the ground was falling out from under him. Jamal stood on the hot pavement outside the restaurant, the blinding midday sun beating down on his custom-tailored suit. He felt exposed, naked, without the heavy gold watch on his wrist. He walked over to the valet stand, handing the young kid his crumpled ticket. "Just bring it around quickly," Jamal said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I'm in a rush." The kid looked at the ticket, then looked down at his clipboard. He frowned, flipping to the second page. "Sir, your car is not here." "What do you mean it is not here?" Jamal asked, his voice rising, breaking his carefully cultivated calm. "It is a pristine white Mercedes S-Class. You parked it right up front." The kid pointed toward the busy street. "A tow truck came and got it about 20 minutes ago, sir." The driver said the corporate lease was pulled and it was a mandatory repossession. Jamal felt the concrete sidewalk sway beneath his expensive leather shoes. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling violently. He opened his rideshare app requesting a premium car, but the screen immediately flashed red. A small message popped up telling him his payment method was invalid and his account was suspended. He had no cash, he had no working cards, and now he had no car. He had to walk 4 blocks to the nearest MARTA train station. His light gray silk shirt was clinging to his back, soaked with nervous sweat. He rode the train heading south, sitting in a plastic seat next to high school kids playing loud music, feeling like a complete miserable failure. When he finally got off at his stop, he had to walk another long mile under the brutal Georgia sun to get back to the estate. As he turned the corner onto the quiet tree-lined street, his stomach dropped. He saw the flashing, bright yellow lights. 2 massive, flatbed tow trucks were parked in the wide driveway of Andre's house. Jamal broke into a desperate run, his chest heaving, his ruined leather shoes slapping hard against the asphalt. He saw his wife Brenda standing on the front lawn. Her arms were crossed tight across her chest, and heavy tears were streaming down her face. On the back of the first heavy truck was his white Mercedes. On the second truck, strapped down by thick steel chains, was Brenda's brand new luxury SUV. "Hey," Jamal yelled, waving his arms wildly as he sprinted up the driveway. "Put those down right now. That is my personal property." A heavy-set man in a bright safety vest stepped out from behind the second truck. He held a thick aluminum clipboard. "Are you Jamal Carter?" the man asked, his voice completely bored. "Yes, I am Jamal Carter," Jamal said, gasping for air, leaning his hands on his knees. "You are making a massive legal mistake. I am the CEO of a development firm. You cannot just steal my vehicles." The man did not look impressed. He flipped a page on his clipboard, dragging a pen down the paper. "Not according to this contract, buddy. You are listed as a secondary driver on a commercial fleet lease. The primary leaseholder revoked all authorization this morning." Jamal stared at the man, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Who is the primary leaseholder?" he asked, though he already felt the terrifying answer settling deep in his gut. The repo man tapped the paper with a thick, calloused finger. "Davis Commercial Holdings. We got the emergency order directly from their legal department an hour ago. All corporate assets assigned to this residential address are being seized effective immediately." Jamal turned slowly and looked at Brenda. She looked back at him, her face pale and completely frightened. "Jamal," Brenda said, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "My credit card stopped working at the grocery store an hour ago. I had to leave a whole cart full of food in the middle of the aisle. The cashier cut my card in half. What is happening to us?" Jamal walked back over to the tow truck driver, trying to stand tall. "There has to be a standard grace period," Jamal said, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice was thin and weak. "Let me make a phone call to the bank." "The bank has absolutely nothing to do with this," the driver said, climbing up into the high cab of the truck. "The holding company bought out the remainder of the leases in cash and ordered an immediate physical seizure. You do not own these cars, Mr. Carter. You never put a single dime toward them." The heavy diesel engines roared to life, shooting dark exhaust into the pristine air. Jamal stood on the manicured lawn, the very grass he claimed to own just 12 hours ago, and watched his entire manufactured identity get strapped down and hauled away down the street. He looked over to the backyard toward the small wooden building he had padlocked yesterday. The heavy silver padlock was gone. The heavy double doors were closed and locked from the inside. The antique tools were no longer rusting in the mud. Brenda walked over to him, grabbing his arm tightly. "Jamal, we need to call my dad right now. We need to beg for his forgiveness." Jamal yanked his arm away, his blind fear mutating into a hot, toxic anger. "I am not apologizing to that arrogant old man," Jamal spit out, pointing toward the workshop. "He is trying to publicly ruin me." "He is not trying to ruin you," Brenda said, crying harder now, the reality crashing down on her. "He is just taking back what actually belongs to him because you pushed him too far." Jamal did not want to hear the truth. He marched up the concrete front steps and threw open the heavy oak doors of the house. He was going to find Andre and demand his life back. But the grand foyer was empty. The quiet hallway simply echoed with the frantic sound of his own footsteps mocking his panic. He had absolutely nothing left to leverage, and his nightmare was only just beginning. Jamal stood in the silent foyer, his chest heaving, his mind racing for a way out. The house felt different now, like a trap closing in on him. He ran up the curved staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time, heading straight for his bedroom. He frantically tore through the drawers of his solid mahogany dresser, tossing expensive silk ties and designer belts onto the floor. He needed cash. He needed a lifeline, and he needed a place to project power. He found a crumpled $50 bill hidden inside an old money clip at the back of the bottom drawer. It was not a fortune, Mom, but it was enough to get him across town. He ignored Brenda, who was still crying loudly in the kitchen, and ran out the back door. He jogged 3 blocks down the street, his gray suit clinging to his sweaty skin until he reached the main avenue. He hailed a battered yellow taxi, sliding into the worn vinyl back seat, and gave the driver the address for the Peachtree Pines Country Club. The country club was his absolute sanctuary. It was an exclusive, pristine fortress of wealth where the city elite gathered to drink scotch and make deals on the golf course. Jamal spent 4 days a week there, sitting in the leather armchairs of the executive lounge, pretending to be a master of the universe. He figured he could go there, order a stiff drink on his tab, and use the club internet to figure out how to untangle this massive misunderstanding. The taxi pulled up to the grand circular driveway of the club. The uniformed valet attendants, who usually rushed to open the doors of his white Mercedes, just stood there, staring at the beat-up cab. Jamal tossed the crumpled $50 bill at the driver, not waiting for the change, and marched up the wide marble steps. He adjusted his collar, wiped the sweat from his brow, and pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping into the cool, air-conditioned lobby. He walked straight past the grand piano, heading for the mahogany doors of the private lounge. But before his hand could even touch the brass handle, a firm voice stopped him. "Mr. Carter," a voice called out, echoing across the marble floor. Jamal turned around. It was the head concierge, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Thomas. Thomas always greeted Jamal with a warm, respectful smile and a slight bow. But right now, Thomas was not smiling, and he was not alone. Standing right behind him were two large, broad-shouldered security guards wearing dark suits and serious expressions. "Thomas, my man," Jamal said, forcing his signature arrogant grin, stepping toward the polished front desk. "I need my usual table in the back corner. I'm expecting some important calls and I need absolute privacy." "I am afraid you cannot go in there," Sir Thomas said, his voice flat, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. "In fact, I am going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately." Jamal stopped in his tracks, his forced smile faltering. "What are you talking about?" Jamal asked, a nervous laugh escaping his throat. "I am a premier tier member. I basically live in that lounge. Let me through, Thomas. I am not in the mood for jokes today." "This is not a joke," Mr. Carter Thomas said, picking up a heavy embossed piece of paper from the desk. "We received a direct notice from the primary account holder an hour ago. Your membership has been permanently terminated effective immediately." Jamal felt his stomach drop all over again. He stepped closer to the desk, his voice rising, carrying across the quiet lobby. "I am the account holder," Jamal snapped, slamming his hand down on the smooth marble. "My name is on the locker, my name is on the tab, and my name is on the membership card." "Your name is on the guest registry," Thomas corrected, his tone turning ice cold. "The primary sponsor for your account and the individual who has paid your $30,000 annual dues for the past 4 years is Mr. Andre Davis. And Mr. Davis has officially and permanently severed his sponsorship. You are currently trespassing on private property, Mr. Carter." A few wealthy patrons sitting in the lobby chairs lowered their newspapers and turned to watch the commotion. Jamal felt their eyes burning into his back. He recognized one of them, a prominent real estate developer he had been trying to network with for months. The developer looked at Jamal with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "You cannot do this," Jamal yelled, the panic completely taking over his brain, making him reckless. "I have meetings scheduled here. I have a locker full of custom golf clubs. You tell Andre Davis that he cannot just erase me from society." Thomas nodded calmly to the two large men standing behind him. "Escort this gentleman off the property," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "If he resists, call the Atlanta police and have him arrested for trespassing." The two security guards stepped forward, grabbing Jamal tightly by his upper arms. Their grips were like iron vices digging into his expensive suit jacket, lifting him slightly off the ground. "Get your hands off me," Jamal screamed, struggling uselessly against their massive weight. "Do you know who I am? I am a CEO. I am a visionary. You cannot touch me." They did not listen. They simply turned him around and marched him forcefully across the marble floor, his designer shoes skidding awkwardly across the polished surface. The wealthy patrons watched in dead silence as the loud, arrogant man, who always bragged about his massive deals, was dragged out the front doors like a common criminal. The guards pushed Jamal out onto the hot concrete of the circular driveway. He stumbled forward, barely catching his balance before the heavy glass doors slammed shut behind him. He stood there in the blistering heat, surrounded by luxury cars that did not belong to him, staring at the fortress he was no longer allowed to enter. The country club was never his. The cars were never his. The house was never his. He was just a loud man living entirely in a quiet man's shadow, and the shadow had just disappeared, leaving him to burn alone in the sun. I drove my dark green Chevy truck into the heart of downtown Atlanta, letting the heavy engine rumble against the sleek glass buildings. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the tallest skyscraper on Peachtree Street. The valet attendant, a young kid in a sharp red vest, rushed over to open my heavy door. "Welcome back, Mr. Davis," he said, treating my beat-up truck with the same absolute reverence he gave to the imported sports cars parked nearby. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, handing him the keys. "Take good care of her. I walked to the private executive elevator, pressing my thumb flat against the brass biometric scanner. The heavy steel doors slid closed, and I shot up 40 floors, leaving the loud, chaotic noise of the city streets far behind me. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse reception area. The floors were polished black marble, and the walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a massive, unbroken view of the entire city skyline. This was the headquarters of Hayes & Associates, the most ruthless corporate law firm in the state of Georgia. But they did not own this building. I own this building. I bought it 12 years ago entirely in cash, using a blind trust. I walked past the reception desk, nodding to the paralegals, who all immediately stood up straight and silenced their phones as I passed. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to the corner office, stepping into a massive room that smelled like expensive coffee and quiet, absolute power. Mr. Hayes was standing by the massive glass window looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. He was wearing a dark custom suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. He turned around as I walked in, walking over to a side table to pour 2 cups of black coffee from a silver pot. "You look terrible, Andre," Mr. Hayes said, handing me a fine porcelain cup. I took a slow sip, letting the bitter warmth settle my angry stomach. "I buried my brother yesterday," I said, walking over to the window to stand beside him. "And I spent this morning watching a boy play dress-up in my house, pouring my liquor for strangers and throwing my tools in the mud. I have earned the right to look terrible." Mr. Hayes chuckled softly, shaking his head. He gestured toward the massive, sprawling city below us. "I pulled the plug on everything, Andre," he said, his voice dropping into a serious, cold business tone. "The country club memberships are permanently terminated. The vehicle leases are canceled, and the cars have been physically repossessed from your driveway. The shadow accounts have been locked down, and the commercial lines of credit are officially frozen. Jamal Carter currently has exactly $40 to his name and absolutely zero access to the Davis family fortune." I looked out over the city, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. From this high up, you could see the entire south side of Atlanta. You could see the sprawling industrial parks, the massive strip malls, the new residential high-rises, and the vast commercial shipping warehouses. I owned half of it. I spent 40 years working as a master carpenter, building custom furniture and installing crown molding because I genuinely loved the honest work. I loved the feeling of wood and steel in my bare hands. I loved the sweat and the quiet satisfaction of a job done perfectly. But what Jamal and the rest of the world did not understand was that I took every single dollar from my carpentry business and quietly invested it in commercial real estate decade after decade. I built a massive financial empire hidden behind a complex maze of corporate holding companies. I kept my name off the buildings, and I kept my hands rough because I never wanted my daughter to grow up acting like a spoiled, entitled princess. I wanted her to value hard work, not inherited money. "He thought I was just an old, tired man with a hobby," I said, pointing down at a massive commercial complex in the distance. "He thought the house was my only real asset. He thought I was weak and vulnerable because I chose to be quiet. People like Jamal only respect loud money," Mr. Hayes said, walking back over to his heavy mahogany desk. "They do not understand quiet power. They do not understand that the man holding the hammer is usually the man who owns the entire building and the land underneath it. But cutting him off is only step one, Andre. We have a much bigger, much more dangerous problem on our hands." I turned away from the glass window, looking at my oldest friend and trusted advisor. "What do you mean?" I asked, taking a seat in a deep leather armchair. I took away his toys. "The lesson is over. Now he and Brenda can pack their bags, move out of my house, and learn how to survive in the real, unforgiving world." Mr. Hayes sat down behind his massive desk, his expression turning grim and deadly serious. He unlocked his top desk drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He dropped it onto the polished wood surface. The loud smack echoed sharply in the quiet room. "The lesson is not over, Andre. Mr. Hayes said, resting his hands flat on top of the dossier. You told me to freeze his accounts, so my forensic accounting team ran a full deep audit on his personal finances to sever the ties cleanly. What we found is not just arrogance. It is pure, reckless desperation. Jamal is not just a loudmouth freeloader, Andre. He is a criminal, and he is dragging your daughter directly into the line of fire. I looked at the heavy manila folder sitting in the center of the mahogany desk. I did not reach for it right away. I have lived a long time, and I know that once you open certain doors, you can never close them again. I leaned forward in my leather chair, keeping my eyes locked on Mr. Hayes. Explain it to me, I said, my voice barely a whisper in the massive, quiet office. Mr. Hayes flipped open the cover of the dossier. Inside were stacks of bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and heavily redacted legal documents. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the polished wood, stopping right in front of me. Jamal started that development firm 4 years ago, Mr. Hayes said, tapping the paper with a silver pen. He gathered about $2 million in seed money from legitimate mid-level investors. He promised them a massive return on a commercial strip mall project out in Decatur, but he never bought the land, Andre. He never even applied for the zoning permits. I stared at the numbers on the page. Where did the money go, I asked. Mr. Hayes sighed a heavy, tired sound. He spent it, Andre. He used the investor capital to fund his fake lifestyle. He bought those custom suits, he leased those luxury cars, and he paid for those lavish dinners at the country club, all using stolen money. He was running a textbook Ponzi scheme right out of your guest bedroom. He was paying the early investors with money from the new investors to keep the illusion alive. I felt a cold anger rising in my chest. He is a thief, I said, shaking my head. He is a common thief wearing an expensive suit. It gets worse, Mr. Hayes said, sliding another document across the desk. A few months ago, the well ran dry. The legitimate investors started asking hard questions, demanding to see progress on the construction site. Jamal panicked. He needed a massive influx of cash immediately to cover his tracks and keep the investors quiet. But no bank in the state of Georgia would give him a loan because his credit is completely destroyed. So where did he go, I asked, feeling a dark, heavy dread settling over me. Mr. Hayes pulled out a grainy black and white photograph and laid it gently on top of the pile. It showed Jamal standing in a dark alleyway, talking to two men. The men were not wearing suits. They looked rough, dangerous, and completely out of place in Jamal's pristine, fake world. He went to the streets. Mr. Hayes said, his voice grim. He borrowed $300,000 from a predatory lending syndicate operating out of a salvage yard in East Point. These are not bankers, Andre. These are loan sharks. They are violent, ruthless men who do not care about court orders or cease and desist letters. They only care about their money and their massive illegal interest rates. I picked up the photograph, studying the terrified look on Jamal's face in the grainy image. How much time does he have, I asked. The syndicate gave him a hard deadline, Mr. Hayes said, leaning back in his chair. He promised to pay them back in full with $75,000 in interest by the end of this week. He thought he could secure a new round of legitimate funding from those investors he hosted at your house last night. He was going to use their new money to pay off the loan sharks, but I just froze all of his accounts. I said the reality of the situation finally clicking into place, and I repossessed his cars in front of the entire neighborhood. The illusion is broken. The new investors are going to run away as fast as they can. Exactly, Mr. Hayes said, nodding slowly. You pulled the rug out from under him, Andre. Jamal has absolutely no way to generate that kind of cash. He's completely trapped, and he is out of time. The men he borrowed money from will not accept excuses. When he misses that payment, they will come looking for him. I felt a sudden sharp spike of absolute terror slicing through my anger. Brenda, I said, standing up from the leather chair, my heart pounding in my ears. He lives in my house. My daughter lives in my house. If these men come looking for Jamal, they are going to come to my front door. Mr. Hayes stood up as well. his face tense. "I have already dispatched a private security team to monitor the perimeter of your estate," he said, trying to reassure me. "They are armed and they are highly trained. Brenda is safe, Andre. I promise you that." "But the damage is already done," I said, pacing across the expensive carpet. "He brought this poison into my home. He put my only child in the crosshairs of a violent criminal syndicate just so he could pretend to be a rich man for a few more months. What do you want to do?" Mr. Hayes asked, watching me closely. "We could go to the police. We have enough financial evidence to have Jamal arrested for fraud right now. It would get him out of the house and put him behind bars where the syndicate cannot reach him." "No," I said, stopping by the massive glass window looking out over the city again. "If we involve the police now, Brenda will be dragged through a massive public trial. Her name is legally tied to him. The press will destroy her reputation and she will be humiliated in front of the entire city. She does not deserve that." "Then how do we handle this?" Mr. Hayes asked. "We wait," I said, my voice turning to ice. "Jamal is a cornered rat right now. He is desperate, terrified, and completely out of options. A man like that will always reveal his true nature. He will try to find a way out, and when he does, he will make a fatal mistake. We are going to watch him closely, Hayes. We are going to let him dig his own grave, and when he is deep enough, we will bury him in it." Mr. Hayes nodded, closing the heavy manila folder. "I will keep the security team on high alert," he said. "Be careful, Andre. A desperate man is the most dangerous animal on earth." "I'm not afraid of Jamal Carter," I said, turning away from the window and walking toward the heavy mahogany doors. "I survived the streets of Atlanta long before I owned them. Jamal is about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you disrespect the man who built the house you sleep in." Jamal stumbled through the heavy glass doors of the transit station, his chest tight with a suffocating panic. The Georgia heat had baked the concrete of the city, and the air was thick, heavy with exhaust fumes and the smell of melting asphalt. He had ridden the train back toward the downtown district, desperately making calls from a cheap prepaid phone that he bought with his last $40. Every single investor had blocked his number. Every friend from the country club, the people who drank his expensive liquor just last night, had sent his desperate calls straight to voicemail. He was completely radioactive, a walking disease that no one wanted to touch. He walked into the dim, flickering light of the public parking garage, heading toward the back street exit. The massive garage was mostly empty at this hour, smelling of old motor oil and stagnant, dirty water pooling in the corners. His designer leather shoes clicked loudly on the stained concrete, the sound echoing off the low, oppressive ceiling. He needed to find a quiet place, to think, a place where Brenda could not yell at him and where Andre could not look at him with those cold, dead, knowing eyes. He turned a blind corner, walking past a long row of parked cars, when a massive shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar ahead of him. Jamal froze instantly. The breath caught hard and painful in his dry throat. A man stepped into the pale yellow light of a broken overhead bulb. He was wearing a dark, heavy leather jacket despite the blistering summer heat outside. He had a thick, jagged scar running violently down the right side of his neck. Behind him, two more men stepped out from between a rusted pickup truck and a solid concrete wall. They were huge men, built like industrial refrigerators, moving with a quiet, terrifying grace that only violent men possess. Jamal took a slow, trembling step back, his hands coming up defensively in front of his chest. "Silas," Jamal said, his voice cracking, a high-pitched sound of pure, unfiltered terror. "What are you doing here? We agreed to meet on Friday afternoon. It is only Wednesday." The man named Silas did not smile. He walked slowly toward Jamal, his heavy steel-toed boots making absolutely no sound on the pavement. He stopped exactly 2 feet away, invading Jamal's personal space, smelling violently like stale cigarette smoke and cheap peppermint candy. "Plans change, Jamal," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the quiet garage. "I heard some very disturbing rumors this afternoon." I heard a flatbed tow truck dragged a beautiful, expensive white Mercedes right out of your manicured driveway. I heard you got physically thrown out of the Peachtree Club like a rabid stray dog. Jamal swallowed hard, his mouth tasting like dry sand. That is just a temporary cash flow issue, Jamal stammered, stepping back until his shoulder blades hit the cold, hard surface of a concrete pillar. It is a massive misunderstanding with my bank. I'm resolving the paperwork right now as we speak. Silas leaned in close, placing one heavy, scarred hand on the concrete pillar, right next to Jamal's sweating head. You do not have a bank account, Jamal. You have a massive hole in your pocket and you used my money to fill it. One of the massive men behind Silas stepped forward smoothly and drove a brutal, punishing punch straight into Jamal's soft stomach. Jamal folded completely in half, gasping violently for air, falling to his weak knees on the filthy, oil-stained concrete. The pain was blinding, white-hot, radiating through his ribs, forcing every ounce of oxygen out of his lungs. He coughed violently, tasting copper blood in the back of his throat. Silas looked down at him, his scarred face completely empty of any human emotion. My money does not experience cash flow issues, Jamal. My money expects a massive return exactly when you promised it to me. $300,000 in principal and $75,000 in interest. I have it, Jamal wheezed, clutching his stomach tightly, looking up with pathetic tears streaming down his face. I swear to you, Silas. My father-in-law, he is secretly rich. He owns half the commercial real estate in the entire city. He just cut me off today, but I can get the cash from him. I can get you double what I owe. Just give me 1 week. Silas crouched down smoothly, grabbing a thick handful of Jamal's expensive gray suit jacket, pulling him violently upward until they were eye to eye. I do not care about your father-in-law. Silas whispered, his breath hot and foul against Jamal's face. I do not care about your pathetic family drama, and I certainly do not care about your empty excuses. You came to my scrapyard playing the big shot CEO. You took my cash in a briefcase. Now you are going to pay it back. Jamal sobbed loudly, the pure, unadulterated fear breaking his spirit completely. Please, he begged, his voice pathetic and small. Just give me a few more days to figure this out. Silas let go of the ruined jacket, letting Jamal slump heavily back against the concrete pillar. He stood up slowly, smoothing out the wrinkles in his leather coat. You have exactly 48 hours, Silas said, his voice echoing dangerously in the empty parking garage. 48 hours, Jamal. If I do not have my money by Friday night, I'm not going to send my boys to beat you up in an alley. I'm going to send them directly to your front door. We know exactly where you live. We know exactly what your beautiful wife looks like. And we know you do not have any private security to stop us. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut tight, trembling uncontrollably on the floor. 48 hours, Silas repeated, stepping back into the shadows. Do not make me come looking for you again. The three dangerous men turned smoothly and walked away, disappearing into the dark, silent depths of the parking garage. Jamal stayed on his knees for a very long time, the cold, dirty concrete pressing into his ruined, sweaty suit. He was completely out of time, and he was completely alone in the dark. The grand illusion of his life was dead. The brutal reality was here, and it was absolutely going to kill him. He dragged his bruised body up, leaning heavily against the concrete pillar for support. He wiped the tears in the dark garage dirt from his swollen face. His mind was racing now, spinning wildly and dangerously out of control. Silas was going to kill him. Silas was going to hurt Brenda. He could not run away. He had absolutely no money to run with. He thought about Andre sitting safely in his massive estate. He thought about the massive fortune sitting quietly in holding companies protected by corporate trusts and locked away safely behind expensive lawyers. Andre had the absolute power to save his life with one single easy phone call. But Andre had maliciously chosen to humiliate him, to throw him out into the cold streets to watch him suffer and burn. A dark, incredibly vicious thought started to form deep in Jamal's mind. It was a poisonous, desperate idea born out of pure primal survival. If the arrogant old man was not going to willingly give him the money, then Jamal was going to take it by force. He was going to take the massive house, he was going to take the hidden commercial empire, and he was going to take Andre's dignity right along with it. Jamal stumbled out of the parking garage, walking back out into the blistering, unforgiving sunlight. He was no longer a fake CEO trying to impress wealthy investors. He was a cornered, desperate animal fighting for his very life, and he was finally ready to tear the throat out of anyone who stood in his way. Jamal walked for 2 long miles, the blistering city sun beating down heavily on his ruined gray suit. He needed a doctor, a man with a valid medical license, and absolutely no moral compass. His desperate mind searched through his past shady dealings until he remembered a man named Dr. Robert Vance. Vance used to run a highly lucrative private clinic in Buckhead before a massive malpractice lawsuit stripped him of his hospital privileges and buried him in suffocating legal debt. Jamal had helped Vance hide a significant amount of assets 3 years ago during the absolute worst of the bankruptcy hearings. Vance owed him a massive life-saving favor. Jamal found a grimy payphone outside a dilapidated empty gas station. He fed his last few silver coins into the rusted slot and dialed the number he had memorized years ago. Vance answered on the 4th ring, his voice sounding tired and deeply suspicious. "It is Jamal," he said, keeping his voice very low, looking nervously over his sweating shoulder. "I need a consultation, Robert, right now." Vance hesitated, breathing heavily into the receiver, but he finally agreed to meet at his new depressing office located in a rundown strip mall on the far outskirts of the city. Jamal spent his last $20 on a cab ride, arriving at a faded brick building with a flickering, broken neon sign in the dirty front window. Jamal pushed through the heavy glass door, stepping into a cramped, dusty waiting room. Dr. Vance was standing nervously behind the cheap reception desk, wearing a stained white coat and looking 10 years older than the last time Jamal saw him. "You look terrible, Jamal," Vance said, reaching past him to lock the deadbolt on the front door. "I'm running completely out of time," Jamal said, following the defeated doctor down a narrow hallway into a small, windowless examination room. "I need your professional expertise, Robert. I need you to create a very specific, highly documented medical history for my father-in-law, Andre Davis." Vance sat down heavily on a rolling metal stool, crossing his arms tight across his chest. "What kind of medical history?" he asked, his tired eyes narrowing with sudden suspicion. "The kind that proves he is completely incapable of managing his own massive estate," Jamal said, leaning forward, placing his hands flat on the cold examination table. "I need a massive paper trail, Robert. I need backdated medical files showing a severe, rapid cognitive decline. I need a formal, undisputed diagnosis of advanced dementia." Vance shook his head immediately, holding up both of his trembling hands. "No," he said, his voice rising in sheer panic. "Absolutely not, Jamal. I am barely holding on to my state medical license as it is. If the medical board catches me forging dementia records for a man I have never even physically examined, I will go straight to federal prison." "You are already going to prison, Robert," Jamal lied, his voice turning cold and completely ruthless in the quiet room. "I have been under severe investigation by a forensic accounting firm all morning. They have all of my old financial files, including the hidden ledgers from your messy bankruptcy case. They know exactly how much cash we hid from the federal courts." Vance turned completely pale, the color draining rapidly from his face, leaving him looking sick and utterly terrified. "You promised me those files were destroyed," Vance whispered, his hands starting to shake violently against his knees. "Things change," Jamal said, using the exact same terrifying phrase the loan shark had used on him an hour earlier. "I can protect you, Robert. I can make those ledgers disappear forever before the auditors find them. But I need this favor right now. I need the forged, manufactured medical records, and I need you to sign off on a psychiatric evaluation declaring Andre legally incompetent to handle his own finances." Vance stared blankly at the dirty linoleum floor, breathing heavily, completely trapped in Jamal's vicious, inescapable web of lies. "What exactly do you need the files to say?" Vance asked, his voice defeated and totally hollow. Jamal smiled, a cold, predatory grimace spreading across his bruised face. I need a timeline starting 6 months ago, Jamal said, pacing the small, confined room. Show a documented history of severe memory loss, paranoia, and dangerous, unpredictable behavior. Write down that he leaves the gas stove on, say he forgets his own name in the middle of conversations, say he becomes violently aggressive with his own family members. Build a wall of medical evidence so incredibly thick that no probate judge in the state of Georgia will ever dare to question it. Vance turned slowly to his old dusty computer terminal. His shoulders slumped in total miserable defeat. He pulled up a blank medical template, his shaking fingers hovering over the plastic keyboard. Who is the primary caretaker on record? Vance asked, typing the preliminary patient data into the system. I am, Jamal said, standing right behind him, watching the fake diagnosis appear on the glowing screen. My wife is far too emotional to handle his complex medical care. I'm stepping up as the responsible, deeply loving son-in-law. Vance printed out 6 dense pages of highly detailed, completely fraudulent medical records. He signed his name at the bottom of each page, stamping them with his official medical seal, sealing his own criminal fate right alongside Jamal's desperate plot. Now, Jamal said, snatching the warm papers eagerly from the printer tray, I need one more thing. I need a standard legal conservatorship form, granting me immediate emergency power of attorney over all of his medical and financial decisions. Vance opened a locked metal filing cabinet, pulling out a thick stack of blank legal forms. He handed one to Jamal, his hands still trembling uncontrollably. He has to sign it, Jamal Vance said, stating the obvious legal requirement. A judge will never grant you power of attorney without the patient's physical signature right there on that exact bottom line. Do not worry about the signature, Jamal said, folding the fraudulent documents carefully and sliding them deep into the inside pocket of his ruined suit jacket. I know exactly how to handle the arrogant old man. By tomorrow night, Andre Davis will sign away absolutely everything he owns, and he will not even realize he did it. Jamal rode a slow, rattling city bus back to the wealthy South Side neighborhood. The sun had finally set, leaving the humid Georgia air thick and sticky. He got off 2 blocks away from the estate, walking quietly under the cover of the massive oak trees. Mr. Hayes had hired private security, but the guards were parked out by the main iron gate watching the street. Jamal knew the property better than they did. He slipped through a gap in the tall privacy hedges, creeping through the dark shadows of the backyard like a thief in his own home. The massive house was entirely dark. Brenda had completely exhausted herself crying and was probably asleep in the upstairs bedroom. Andre was out in his workshop, locked away in his own quiet world. The heavy back door was unlocked. Jamal turned the brass handle, slowly pushing the door open, wincing at the slight squeak of the metal hinges. He stepped into the massive, pristine kitchen. His heart was hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He had the fraudulent medical records folded tightly in his pocket. But Dr. Vance was right. A judge would need to see a physical, undeniable pattern of danger right alongside the paperwork. Jamal pulled out his cheap prepaid phone, opening the camera application. He was going to build a completely terrifying visual narrative. He started looking around the dark kitchen. On the marble island counter, sitting next to a neat stack of mail, were Andre's heavy brass keys. The keys to the old green Chevy truck and the keys to the front gate. Jamal picked them up, the metal clinking softly in his sweaty palm. He walked over to the massive stainless steel refrigerator, pulling open the heavy bottom freezer drawer. He shoved the brass keys deep under a bag of frozen vegetables, hiding them completely from sight. He stepped back and took a flash photograph of the open freezer, documenting the exact kind of bizarre, senseless action a severe dementia patient would perform. Jamal moved quietly down the carpeted hallway, heading toward the main floor bathroom. He knew Andre kept his daily medication in there. He pushed the door open, turning on the dim yellow vanity light. Sitting on the polished marble counter was a clear plastic pill organizer filled with blood pressure pills and joint supplements. Jamal picked up the plastic container. He popped open every single daily compartment. He dumped the carefully sorted pills out, letting them scatter noisily across the smooth marble. He picked them up by the handful, mixing the different colors and shapes together, shoving them back into the wrong compartments in a chaotic, dangerous mess. He intentionally dropped a dozen pills onto the bathroom floor, leaving them scattered across the pristine white tiles like a handful of discarded candy. He held his phone up, capturing the terrifying image of a medical disaster waiting to happen. The story was becoming real now. It was the story of a confused, failing old man who could no longer be trusted to keep himself alive. He crept back into the kitchen, his confidence growing with every single planted lie. He needed a grand finale. He needed something so incredibly dangerous, so completely undeniable that the courts would grant him emergency power of attorney before the sun even set tomorrow. Jamal walked over to the massive 6-burner professional gas stove. He reached out and turned the heavy steel dial on the front right burner. He turned it just past the ignition click, stopping before the spark could catch. A soft, deadly hiss began to echo in the quiet kitchen. The sharp, toxic smell of raw, natural gas immediately started to leak into the air. Jamal did not stop there. He opened a lower cabinet, grabbing a dry, white cotton dish towel. He pulled a cheap plastic lighter from his pocket, flicking the wheel until a small flame appeared. He held the flame to the corner of the towel, letting the dry cotton catch fire, burning for exactly 3 seconds before he stamped it out with his shoe. He took the scorched, blackened towel and draped it carefully over the metal grate of the stove, right next to the hissing gas burner. It was a perfect, terrifying trap. It looked exactly like an old man had tried to make tea, forgot to light the burner, dropped his towel, and wandered away, leaving his entire family to burn in their sleep. Jamal raised his phone, his hands completely steady now, and took 3 clear photographs of the hissing stove and the burned towel. The smell of the gas was getting stronger, filling the kitchen with a heavy, nauseating odor. Jamal turned the steel dial back to the off position, cutting off the deadly flow of gas. He left the scorched towel sitting there, a silent, damning witness to a crime that never happened. He stood in the dark kitchen, surrounded by the carefully constructed evidence of Andre's fake madness. He slid the prepaid phone back into his pocket. He patted the chest of his ruined suit jacket, feeling the folded, fraudulent conservatorship papers inside. The stage was perfectly set. The trap was fully loaded. All he needed now was for the arrogant old man to step right into it and sign his entire empire away. Jamal turned around and walked silently up the carpeted stairs, heading toward his bedroom to wait for the morning light. The morning sun broke through the heavy oak trees, casting long shadows across the dew-covered grass. Jamal woke up early, staring at the ceiling of the guest bedroom. He did not shower and he did not shave. He needed to look exactly like a broken man, a man who had finally realized the massive scale of his mistakes. He put on a plain, faded blue shirt and a pair of old, worn jeans. He practiced his expression in the bathroom mirror, forcing his eyes to widen, letting his shoulders slump forward in complete defeat. He walked downstairs, stepping carefully over the floorboards, avoiding the kitchen entirely. He walked out the back door, stepping onto the damp grass, heading straight for the workshop. The heavy double doors were open now, the bright morning light spilling onto the sawdust-covered floor. The sharp, clean smell of freshly cut pine hung heavy in the warm air. Andre was standing at his massive wooden workbench, wearing a thick canvas apron over a plain white undershirt. He was running a heavy iron hand plane over a long, beautiful piece of dark mahogany wood. He moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, completely focused on the simple, honest work. The long, thin shavings of wood curled perfectly off the edge of the blade, falling softly to the floor. Jamal stopped in the doorway, taking a deep, shaky breath, preparing for the performance of his life. Andre Jamal said, his voice trembling perfectly, just loud enough to be heard over the sound of the scraping iron. Andre did not stop working. He did not even look up. He pushed the heavy plane forward, the steel blade singing softly against the dense wood. He pulled it back and pushed it forward again, completely ignoring the man standing in the doorway. Jamal stepped inside the workshop, his cheap shoes crunching loudly on the sawdust. He walked closer to the workbench, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. "Please, Andre," Jamal pleaded, letting a single heavy tear roll down his cheek. "I know you do not want to see me right now. I know I have completely destroyed the trust in this house. But I need you to just look at me for 1 minute. I am begging you as a man who has lost absolutely everything." Andre stopped pushing the plane. He set the heavy iron tool down on the wooden bench, moving very slowly. He picked up a clean rag, wiping the sawdust from his rough, calloused hands. Then he turned around, looking at Jamal with eyes that were cold, dark, and completely unreadable. "You have 1 minute," Andre said, his voice a low, flat rumble. Jamal let out a ragged, pathetic sob, dropping his face into his hands. He forced his shoulders to shake, weeping loudly in the quiet workshop. It was a sickening, calculated display of pure manipulation. "I am so sorry," Jamal cried, wiping his wet face with the back of his hand. "I was arrogant, Andre. I was a stupid, arrogant boy playing a game I did not understand. You were right to cut me off. You were right to take the cars and show me the harsh reality of the world. I completely lost my way trying to impress people who do not even care about me. I disrespected your home, I disrespected your brother, and I'm so incredibly ashamed of the man I have become." Andre just stood there, leaning slightly against the heavy workbench, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He simply watched Jamal cry, letting the silence stretch out heavy and uncomfortable. "Brenda and I are moving out today," Jamal continued, his voice thick with fake emotion. "We are packing our bags right now. We are going to find a cheap apartment, and I am going to get a real job working with my hands just like you. I am going to build my life the right way from the ground up, but I am completely trapped, Andre. I have a massive immediate problem, and it is going to destroy Brenda's future if I do not fix it right now." "What kind of problem?" Andre asked, his tone completely neutral. Jamal took a desperate step forward, reaching into his back pocket, his hands shaking violently. "When your lawyers froze the corporate accounts yesterday, it triggered an automatic massive audit with the state tax board. They think I'm trying to hide assets, Andre. They are threatening to freeze Brenda's personal bank accounts and garnish her wages for the next 10 years. I cannot let my wife suffer for my stupid, reckless mistakes." Jamal pulled the folded, fraudulent conservatorship papers from his pocket, smoothing them out nervously with his trembling hands. He held them out toward Andre, his eyes wide and completely desperate. "My accountant said there is exactly one way to stop the audit." Jamal lied, his voice breaking perfectly. "I just need you to sign these standard tax release forms. It simply confirms that the holding company assets are entirely separate from my personal liabilities. It proves that Brenda has absolutely nothing to do with my failed business. If you sign this, the state will back off, and I can walk out of your house and out of your life forever." Andre looked down at the folded papers resting in Jamal's shaking hands. He did not reach for them. He looked back up at Jamal, his dark eyes searching the younger man's sweating face. "You want me to sign legal papers?" Andre said slowly, "After I just froze your accounts for fraud." "It is the only way to protect your daughter," Jamal whispered, another fake tear sliding down his face. "I swear to you on my own life, Andre, I will never ask you for another single thing. I just want to fix this one terrible mistake so I can finally leave you in peace. Please, Andre. Please help me protect Brenda." Jamal held his breath, watching the old man waiting for the trap to snap shut, waiting for the absolute victory he so desperately needed. Andre stood completely still in the quiet workshop, looking down at the shaking pieces of paper in Jamal's hand. He did not feel pity. He did not feel sadness. He felt a deep, absolute, and terrifying clarity. Jamal thought he was a brilliant predator cornering a weak, failing prey. But Jamal did not know that the entire Atlanta estate was secretly wired with high-definition security cameras. Andre had been awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting quietly in his dark study, drinking bitter black coffee. He had watched the live video feed on his secure tablet monitor. He had watched Jamal creep into the pristine kitchen like a cowardly, desperate thief. He watched him hide the brass truck keys deep beneath a bag of frozen vegetables. He watched him go into the bathroom and scatter the crucial blood pressure pills all across the white marble floor. He watched him turn on the deadly gas stove and light the white cotton dish towel on fire, creating a false, terrifying crime scene. Andre knew exactly what Jamal was doing. Mr. Hayes had called him right at dawn, confirming the desperate early morning visit to the disgraced doctor in the rundown strip mall. The papers currently shaking in Jamal's sweaty hand were absolutely not standard tax release forms. They were entirely fraudulent legal documents carefully designed to strip Andre of his freedom, his hard-earned money, and his entire life. But Andre also knew a very old, very true rule about hunting. You can never catch a dangerous rat unless you let it walk completely into the trap and take the bait. Andre let out a long, heavy, exhausted sigh. He deliberately let his broad, muscular shoulders slump forward instantly, shedding the strong, rigid posture of a master carpenter. He allowed a subtle, cloudy confusion to wash completely over his dark eyes. He raised his rough right hand, letting his thick fingers tremble just a fraction of an inch as he reached out slowly to take the papers. "Tax forms," Andre asked, his voice suddenly sounding much older and significantly weaker in the quiet room. "Why do the tax people care about Brenda? I do not really understand this, Jamal. My head feels a little foggy today." Jamal's eyes widened instantly. A brief, sharp flash of absolute predatory joy broke right through his fake, pathetic tears. He stepped closer, eagerly invading Andre's personal space, his voice dripping with a sickening, patronizing sweetness. "It is just a standard, boring government procedure," Andre Jamal said, pointing a shaking finger gently at the dense paragraphs of legal text. "The government gets very confused when corporate accounts are frozen so quickly. They just need a physical signature from the primary account holder to prove that Brenda is not involved in the massive business debts. It is just a simple piece of paper to protect your little girl." Andre looked down at the documents. He did not need his reading glasses to see the bold, clear words printed at the top of the very first page. Emergency conservatorship. Durable power of attorney. Jamal was asking a judge for total uncontested control over every single asset, bank account, and medical decision in Andre's entire life. It was a vicious, unforgiving death sentence written casually on cheap printer paper. "I do not want Brenda to be in any kind of trouble," Andre mumbled, letting his calloused hand shake a little more violently, causing the papers to rustle loudly in the quiet workshop. "I forgot to take my important pills this morning, Jamal. I went into the bathroom, but all the pills were spilled all over the floor. I could not remember which ones to take. I've been so incredibly tired lately." Jamal practically vibrated with dark excitement. The fake forged narrative was coming alive right in front of his greedy eyes. "I know you are so tired," Andre Jamal said, reaching quickly into his pocket and pulling out a sleek silver ink pen. "You have been working so hard for so many long years. You just need to sign these boring papers and then you can go inside the house and finally rest. I will clean up the spilled pills for you. I will take care of absolutely everything from now on." Andre took the silver pen. The metal felt cold and completely foreign in his rough fingers. He looked up at Jamal, staring deeply into the younger man's face. He saw the heavy sweat forming on his forehead. He smelled the expensive custom cologne, completely failing to mask the sour, acidic stench of absolute primal fear. Silas and the violent loan sharks had given Jamal exactly 48 hours to live. This single piece of paper was Jamal's only desperate, pathetic lifeline. Andre thought about his older brother Robert, whom he had just buried in the cold earth. Robert had been a genuinely good man, a man who paid his debts honestly and looked people directly in the eye. When Robert made a mistake, he owned it completely. He stood tall and took the heavy punishment. Jamal was the exact opposite. Jamal was a coward hiding safely behind fake tears and forged medical records, completely willing to throw an innocent old man into a locked psychiatric ward just to save his own miserable skin. "Are you absolutely sure this is the right thing to do?" Andre asked, looking back down at the blank signature line. "I usually have Mr. Hayes read all of my legal papers first. Maybe I should call him right now just to be safe." Jamal reached out quickly, placing his sweaty, trembling hand firmly over Andre's rough knuckles, stopping him from moving away. "No," Jamal said, his voice rising in a sudden sharp spike of panic before he quickly forced it back down into a calm, soothing whisper. "We absolutely do not have time for lawyers today, Andre. The state tax board is going to completely freeze her accounts at noon. Mr. Hayes will just slow the entire process down with useless legal questions. We have to handle this quietly as a family right now to save Brenda." Andre slowly, deliberately pulled his hand away from Jamal's sweaty grip. He looked around his beloved, peaceful workshop. He looked at the heavy hand planes, the sharp chisels, and the half-finished mahogany cabinet sitting in the corner. He had built this place as a pure sanctuary for truth and honest labor. Now he was about to use it to deliver the most devastating, brilliant lie of his entire life. "Okay," Andre whispered, his voice trembling perfectly, leaning heavily into the role of the defeated senile old man. "Show me exactly where to sign Jamal. I just want this terrible mess to be over." Jamal leaned heavily over the thick wooden workbench, his hands shaking violently with eager, greedy anticipation. "Right here at the very bottom," Andre Jamal said, pointing a trembling finger directly at the solid black line. "Just sign your full legal name right there." Andre stood over the fraudulent papers holding the silver pen, carefully over the blank line, perfectly aware that he was holding the absolute undeniable destruction of Jamal Carter right in his hands. "I am signing it," Andre whispered, pressing the tip of the pen against the paper. "I am trusting you, Jamal." Andre pressed the cold silver tip of the pen firmly against the thick white paper. He did not write his normal strong signature. He deliberately loosened his grip, letting his thick fingers tremble violently. He dragged the ink slowly across the page, creating a jagged, barely legible scrawl that perfectly matched the desperate narrative of a failing mind. He crossed the final letter with a weak, pathetic slash and let the heavy silver pen drop loudly onto the wooden workbench. "It is done," Andre whispered, his voice incredibly soft and hollow. "Is Brenda safe now, Jamal?" Jamal did not answer immediately. He stared greedily at the fresh, wet ink on the bottom line. The transformation in the younger man was absolutely instantaneous and incredibly disgusting to watch. The fake, pathetic tears completely vanished, drying up instantly. His slumped, defeated shoulders snapped back, straightening with arrogant pride. The heavy, suffocating fear that had been crushing him evaporated, replaced completely by a cold, victorious smirk. Jamal reached out quickly, snatching the fraudulent conservatorship papers right off the wooden workbench. He folded them sharply with quick, precise movements and tucked them safely back into the inside pocket of his ruined suit jacket. He patted the pocket firmly, a massive sigh of absolute relief escaping his lungs. "She is perfectly safe now," Andre Jamal said, his voice completely stripped of any warmth, returning to its usual arrogant sneer. "You did the right thing, old man. Now why do you not go inside and take a long, quiet nap? You look absolutely terrible." Jamal did not wait for an answer. He turned his back on Andre, completely dismissing the man he believed he had just conquered, and walked confidently out of the workshop. His cheap shoes crunched on the sawdust, but his stride was long and powerful again. He pulled out his cheap prepaid phone, dialing a number quickly as he walked across the damp grass. "Yeah, I have the signature," Jamal barked into the phone, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet backyard. "Call the Fulton County probate judge and get an emergency hearing set for tomorrow morning. I want total control of the estate by noon." Andre stood absolutely still, standing in the doorway of his sanctuary, watching the arrogant thief march back into the massive house. He watched until the heavy back door clicked shut. Then the silence returned to the workshop. Slowly, deliberately, Andre rolled his broad shoulders back. The frail, pathetic stoop completely disappeared from his strong spine. He stood up straight, returning to his full, intimidating height. He looked down at his rough, calloused hands. The violent trembling was completely gone. His hands were as steady as solid stone, just like they had been for the last 40 years. Andre picked up the heavy iron handplane from the workbench. He ran his thumb gently along the razor-sharp steel blade, testing the absolute perfect edge. Jamal thought he was a genius playing a high-stakes game of chess against a blind, foolish opponent. But Jamal was playing checkers on a board that Andre had built himself piece by piece. Andre reached into the deep pocket of his canvas work apron and pulled out his secure encrypted cell phone. He dialed the direct number for the downtown corner office. The line rang exactly one time before the calm, deep voice answered. "Tell me the trap worked," Mr. Hayes said, skipping the formalities entirely. "The trap worked perfectly." Andre set his voice a low, dangerous rumble in the quiet woodshop. He brought the forged medical records and the fake power of attorney. He played his pathetic crying game exactly like we knew he would. "I signed the documents, Hayes. He has the signature and he's calling a judge right now to set an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. I will monitor the court dockets immediately." Mr. Hayes said, the sharp sound of frantic typing echoing in the background. As soon as his sleazy lawyer files that forged petition, it becomes a massive federal crime, Andre. It is no longer just a simple family dispute. He is officially committing severe probate fraud against a protected senior citizen using completely falsified medical evidence. We have him dead to rights. "I want the heavy hammer," Hayes Andre said, looking out at the bright, blinding Georgia sun. "I do not want to just slap his wrist and throw him out of my house. He threatened my daughter. He brought violent loan sharks right to my front door. I want you to completely dismantle him in front of the judge. I want to take away every single fake accomplishment he has ever claimed. I am assembling the entire legal team right now." "Mr. Hayes said, his voice completely cold and completely ruthless. "I'm pulling the irrevocable trust documents from the main vault. I have the forensic accounting reports detailing his massive embezzlement scheme printed and bound. And my security team just pulled the high-definition video footage from your kitchen cameras. We have crystal clear video of him tampering with your life-saving medication and attempting to cause a massive gas explosion. The judge is going to lock him in a cage and throw the key directly into the Chattahoochee River. Make sure you get the best courtroom." Andre said, a hard, unforgiving smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. "If he wants to play the role of the tragic, responsible heir, we are going to give him a massive audience for his final performance." "I will see you in court," Mr. Hayes said. "Dress warm. It is going to be incredibly cold in there for Mr. Carter." The line clicked dead. Andre slid the phone back into his apron pocket. He looked around the quiet, sunlit workshop one last time. He felt a deep, profound sense of peace settling into his chest. The respect was finally over. The long, exhausting 4 years of quiet tolerance were completely finished. Tomorrow morning he was going to walk into a courthouse and remind the entire city exactly who built the foundation they were all standing on. Andre picked up a heavy, solid oak mallet and set it carefully back on the wooden pegboard. He turned off the bright overhead lights, pulled the heavy double doors shut, and locked his own workshop with his own strong hands. The Fulton County Courthouse was a massive structure of cold gray stone and polished marble floors. The air conditioning was turned down so low that the massive hallways felt like an industrial meat locker. We walked through the heavy metal detectors right at 9 o'clock in the morning. Jamal was wearing a brand new dark navy suit. He must have begged or borrowed to get it tailored overnight because he looked absolutely immaculate. He was playing the role of the tragic, responsible son-in-law, and he was completely committed to the performance. He held my right elbow tightly, guiding me slowly down the long hallway, walking at a painfully slow pace. I let my heavy shoulders slump forward, dragging my leather shoes slightly against the smooth marble. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, blinking, slowly playing the exact part of the broken, confused old man that he desperately needed me to be. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors of courtroom number 4. The room was intimidating, built with dark oak paneling and high vaulted ceilings. Brenda was already sitting in the second row of the wooden gallery benches. She looked completely exhausted, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, her eyes red from crying all night. Jamal had told her this was just a simple routine medical hearing to get me some advanced home care. She had absolutely no idea that her husband was currently trying to steal her entire inheritance. I hated seeing the fear in my daughter's eyes. I wanted to reach out and tell her she was safe, but I knew the only way to truly protect her was to let this terrible play run to the very end. Jamal guided me to the heavy plaintiff table, pulling out a heavy wooden chair and patting my shoulder softly right in front of the armed court bailiff. "Just sit here," Andre Jamal whispered, his voice loud enough for the court reporter to clearly hear. "Everything is going to be perfectly fine. I'm going to take care of you now." Sitting next to us at the massive table was a sleazy, sweating attorney named Miller. I recognized him immediately from my decades of doing business in the city. Miller was famous in Atlanta for taking bottom-feeding cases and filing desperate, frivolous lawsuits. He smelled heavily of cheap mints and stale coffee. He leaned over, pulling the forged conservatorship papers from his scuffed leather briefcase, stacking them neatly in front of him. The heavy oak door behind the towering wooden bench swung open. The bailiff shouted loudly, ordering the entire courtroom to rise. I stood up slowly, letting my hands shake violently against the edge of the table. Judge Reynolds walked out, his thick black robes billowing behind him. He was an older man with a stern, unforgiving face known throughout the county for absolutely destroying lawyers who tried to waste his valuable time. Judge Reynolds sat down heavily in his high leather chair, putting on his reading glasses and looking down at the thick legal file sitting on his bench. He struck his heavy wooden gavel, the sharp, violent crack echoing like a gunshot in the quiet, tense room. "I'm calling the emergency probate hearing for the estate of Andre Davis, Judge," Reynolds said, his deep, commanding voice carrying easily across the large courtroom. "I have an expedited petition here requesting immediate durable power of attorney and full permanent conservatorship to be granted to the son-in-law, Mr. Jamal Carter." Jamal stood up respectfully, buttoning his sharp suit jacket, forcing a look of deep, profound sadness onto his lying face. "Yes, Your Honor," Jamal said, his voice completely smooth and entirely fake. "We are dealing with a severe, rapid medical decline. We are just trying to protect my father-in-law from his own failing mind." I sat quietly in my hard wooden chair, staring blankly at the polished table, listening to the arrogant thief dig his own massive grave right in front of a sitting county judge. The courtroom ambush had officially begun, and Jamal was completely unaware that he was the one walking directly into the slaughterhouse. Judge Reynolds looked down at the sleazy attorney sitting next to me. "Proceed, Mr. Miller," the judge said, his voice echoing in the cold room. "Show me exactly why we need to strip this man of his legal rights before 10 o'clock in the morning." Miller stood up quickly, his cheap suit wrinkling at the waist. He wiped a bead of nervous sweat from his balding forehead using a crumpled white handkerchief. "Your Honor," Miller began, his voice dripping with false, rehearsed sympathy. "It is a true tragedy to watch a great man decline. My client, Mr. Carter, has carried the heavy, crushing burden of caring for his father-in-law completely alone. But the situation has escalated rapidly into a life-threatening crisis." Miller reached into his scuffed briefcase, pulling out the thick stack of forged medical records. He handed them to the armed bailiff, who walked them up the wooden steps, placing them directly on the high bench. Judge Reynolds put on his reading glasses, flipping open the heavy file. "What am I looking at, counselor?" the judge asked, scanning the top page. "You are looking at a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, Your Honor," Miller said, stepping out from behind the heavy wooden table. "Signed exactly 24 hours ago by Dr. Robert Vance, a licensed medical professional." The diagnosis is severe advanced dementia complicated by aggressive paranoid delusions. Mr. Davis is completely detached from absolute reality. I sat in my chair, forcing my rough hands to tremble slightly on my lap. I listened to the sleazy lawyer read a completely fabricated medical history into the permanent county record. Miller described memory lapses that never happened. He described violent outbursts completely made up in Jamal's desperate mind. He painted a picture of a frail, broken shell of a man who could not even remember his own name. Judge Reynolds frowned deeply, turning the crisp white pages. "These are incredibly serious claims, Mr. Miller," the judge said, peering over his glasses. "A diagnosis is one thing, but stripping a citizen of his fundamental rights requires absolute undeniable proof of immediate danger. We have the absolute proof, Your Honor." Miller said, a sickening smile briefly touching his sweaty face. Miller reached back into his briefcase. He pulled out a large, heavy manila envelope. He opened the metal clasp and slid out 3 large, glossy, high-definition photographs. He handed them to the bailiff, who carried them up to the judge. I watched Jamal out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting up perfectly straight, his face arranged into a mask of deep, loving concern. He looked over his shoulder, making direct eye contact with Brenda, offering her a slow, comforting nod. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to reach across the table and strangle him right there in front of the armed guards. "Your Honor," Miller said, pacing slowly in front of the judge. The first photograph shows the patient's daily life-saving medication. My client found those pills completely scattered across the bathroom floor, deliberately mixed together in a dangerous, chaotic pile. Mr. Davis has completely lost the cognitive ability to safely administer his own medicine. The judge looked at the first glossy photo, his deep frown deepening into a tight scowl. The second photograph, Miller continued, his voice rising, filling the large, echoing room, shows the patient's heavy brass keys completely frozen inside the kitchen refrigerator. A classic, tragic symptom of severe mental decline. But it is the third photograph, Your Honor, that forced my client to seek immediate emergency intervention. Judge Reynolds slid the third picture to the center of his desk. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. I heard Brenda gasp loudly from the wooden benches behind me. She had not seen the photos. She did not know about the final, terrifying lie. "That photograph," Miller said, pointing a dramatic finger toward the bench, shows the massive 6-burner gas stove inside the family home. Mr. Davis turned the raw gas on, leaving it to completely flood the house. He then placed a highly flammable dry cotton towel directly over the open burner and attempted to light it on fire. If my client had not woken up and intervened, the entire house would have exploded, killing everyone inside. Mr. Davis is an immediate catastrophic danger to himself and to the general public. The courtroom was dead quiet. The heavy, terrifying weight of the lies hung in the cold, conditioned air. Jamal lowered his head, pressing his hands over his face, acting like a man completely traumatized by the near-death experience. Judge Reynolds took off his reading glasses, setting them down softly on the wood. He looked directly down at me. His eyes were no longer stern. They were filled with pity. He saw an old, confused man sitting in a cheap suit, trembling uncontrollably. "Mr. Davis," the judge asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle, "do you understand what these men are saying about you? Do you remember turning on the gas stove in your kitchen?" I looked up at the high wooden bench. I let my mouth hang open slightly. I blinked my eyes rapidly, pretending to be completely overwhelmed by the large room and the loud voices. "I do not want to be in trouble," I whispered, my voice shaking perfectly. "I just want to go back to my workshop. My tools are waiting for me." Jamal leaned over, placing his hand heavily on my arm. "It is okay, Andre," Jamal whispered loudly. "I'm going to make sure you are safe." "Your Honor," Miller said, stepping forward, ready to deliver the final killing blow. "The evidence is completely overwhelming and entirely undeniable. Mr. Davis is entirely unfit to manage his own medical care. Furthermore, he is completely incapable of managing his complex financial estate." The assets must be immediately transferred into my client's legal control to prevent catastrophic financial ruin. Miller paused, making sure the court reporter caught every single word. We are formally requesting that Mr. Jamal Carter be granted immediate durable power of attorney. We are requesting the authority to move Mr. Davis into a secure, locked memory care facility for his own absolute safety. And we are requesting full, unrestricted access to all corporate holding companies' bank accounts and real estate deeds currently in the patient's name. It was the complete total theft of my entire life, packaged neatly as a medical rescue mission. Jamal wanted me locked away in a padded room while he drained my life savings to pay off his violent loan sharks. Judge Reynolds sighed heavily, picking up his wooden gavel. He looked at the forged medical records, and then he looked at the glossy photographs. He had seen hundreds of these tragic cases. The evidence seemed airtight. The lawyer had followed all the legal procedures. The son-in-law looked responsible and willing to take the burden. Based on the submitted medical evidence, Judge Reynolds began, his voice echoing with final authority and the clear, documented danger to the public. I'm prepared to grant the emergency petition for temporary conservatorship. Jamal smiled. He could not help himself. A small, cold, victorious smirk broke right through his tragic facade. He had won. He was going to walk out of this cold courthouse as a millionaire. But Judge Reynolds never got to strike his heavy wooden gavel, because right at that exact moment, the massive heavy oak doors at the very back of the courtroom swung violently open. They hit the wooden walls with a massive booming crash, shaking the entire room and stopping the judge dead in his tracks. Every single head in the courtroom turned around. The armed bailiff instinctively reached for the heavy leather holster on his hip. Jamal whipped his head around, his victorious smirk instantly vanishing, replaced by a look of sheer absolute confusion. I did not turn around. I stopped trembling. I sat perfectly still in my hard wooden chair, feeling the cold air rush in from the hallway. I knew exactly who was standing in that doorway. I knew the cavalry had finally arrived and the slaughter was about to begin. Mr. Hayes walked through the heavy wooden frame of the courtroom doors. He was not alone. 4 sharp-looking paralegals marched right behind him, pushing 2 heavy metal carts. The carts were completely loaded with thick black legal binders and heavy boxes of financial records. Judge Reynolds leaned heavily over his high wooden bench. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" the judge demanded loudly, his voice echoing in the cold room. Mr. Hayes did not stop walking. He marched straight down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the cold marble floor. "My name is William Hayes. Your Honor," he said, his deep voice carrying absolute authority. "I am the personal corporate counsel for Mr. Andre Davis, and I am here to stop a massive, catastrophic fraud from taking place in your courtroom today." Miller jumped up from his chair, knocking his scuffed briefcase to the floor. "I object," Miller shouted, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "This is a closed emergency medical hearing. This man has absolutely no legal standing here." Judge Reynolds slammed his heavy gavel down, shutting Miller up instantly. "I will decide who has standing in my courtroom, Mr. Miller," the judge warned fiercely. "Proceed, Mr. Hayes. You have exactly 2 minutes to explain these boxes before I hold you in contempt of court." Mr. Hayes stopped right next to our heavy wooden table. He looked down at Jamal. Jamal was completely pale, his fake confidence shattering into a million pieces. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Your Honor," Mr. Hayes began gesturing to the heavy metal carts. "The attorney representing Mr. Carter just asked you to hand over the keys to the Davis family fortune, but there is a massive legal problem with his petition. Mr. Davis does not actually own any of the commercial real estate or the massive bank accounts in his own name." Judge Reynolds frowned, leaning closer. "Explain yourself, counselor." Mr. Hayes pulled a thick blue legal folder from the top of the pile. Exactly 10 years ago, Mr. Davis placed every single one of his assets into an ironclad, irrevocable corporate trust. I am the sole executor of that trust. Even if you grant conservatorship today, Jamal Carter cannot touch a single penny of that money. It is legally locked away forever." Jamal stared at Mr. Hayes, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of the water. He had just played his absolute final card and committed a massive federal crime to steal a vault that was completely legally empty. "But that is only the beginning, Your Honor," Mr. Hayes said, his voice turning incredibly cold. "Let us talk about the actual motive behind this desperate, pathetic charade." Mr. Hayes pulled out a thick financial dossier, slapping it heavily onto the plaintiff table right in front of a sweating Jamal. "Jamal Carter is currently the subject of a massive forensic audit," Mr. Hayes said, clearly making sure Brenda heard every single word in the gallery behind us. "He has spent the last 4 years running a fraudulent Ponzi scheme out of his father-in-law's guest bedroom. Yesterday morning, we permanently severed his access to the shadow accounts funding his fake lifestyle. By yesterday afternoon, he was physically threatened by a violent criminal syndicate operating out of East Point." I heard Brenda let out a sharp, terrified cry from the wooden benches. Jamal shrank down into his chair, trying to disappear completely, his hands trembling violently on his lap. "He owes violent loan sharks $375,000, Your Honor," Mr. Hayes declared loudly. "He has exactly 48 hours to pay them back, or they are going to kill him. This man is not trying to save his father-in-law. He's trying to rob a blind trust to save his own miserable life." Miller was shaking uncontrollably now. "Your Honor." Miller stammered weakly, completely losing his arrogant posture. "These are wild, unsubstantiated financial allegations. They have absolutely nothing to do with the severe medical evidence we presented." "I am very glad you brought up the medical evidence, Mr. Miller," Mr. Hayes said, a dangerous, predatory smile appearing on his face. Mr. Hayes reached into his dark suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek, black digital tablet and handed it directly to the armed bailiff. "Mr. Carter presented you with 3 terrifying photographs," Mr. Hayes said, turning to look directly at the judge. "He told you Mr. Davis scattered his own life-saving pills. He told you Mr. Davis hid his truck keys in the freezer. And most severely, he claimed Mr. Davis tried to blow up his own house by leaving the raw gas running on the stove." Judge Reynolds looked from the tablet down to the trembling lawyer. "Get to the point, Mr. Hayes. The point, Your Honor, is that my client is a very wealthy, very private man. His entire estate is wired with hidden high-definition security cameras. The tablet you are holding contains crystal-clear, time-stamped video footage from the kitchen and the bathroom recorded at 3 o'clock this morning." The entire courtroom went dead silent. The cold air felt like heavy lead. Jamal stopped breathing entirely, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. "If you press play on that screen, Your Honor," Mr. Hayes said, his voice ringing with absolute crushing authority, "you will not see an old man suffering from dementia. You will see a desperate, cornered criminal named Jamal Carter. You will watch him dump the pills onto the floor. You will watch him hide the keys in the freezer. And you will watch him turn on the deadly gas and light the towel on fire deliberately, staging a fatal hazard while his own wife slept quietly upstairs." Judge Reynolds stared at Mr. Hayes, his face hardening into a mask of pure judicial rage. He looked down at the tablet screen and tapped his finger against the heavy glass. For 2 long minutes, the only sound in the massive courtroom was the soft, terrifying hiss of the recorded gas burner playing through the small speakers of the tablet. The judge watched the entire silent movie of Jamal's incredible betrayal. He watched the lies unfold in bright, undeniable color. I sat completely still, watching the color drain from Miller's sweaty face, knowing the lawyer had just presented completely falsified evidence to a sitting judge. Judge Reynolds slowly set the tablet down on his heavy wooden desk. He looked up and locked his furious, burning eyes directly onto Jamal Carter. "Mr. Carter," the judge whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, righteous anger. "I have sat on this bench for 30 years. I have seen every kind of thief, liar, and coward, but I have never seen a man so completely willing to destroy his own family to save himself. Jamal tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He looked wildly around the cold courtroom, searching desperately for a way out. He pointed a shaking finger at his own sweating attorney. It was his idea, Jamal screamed, his voice cracking in sheer panic. Miller told me to do it. He said we needed a stronger case. I'm just a victim of bad legal advice. Miller physically recoiled, knocking his wooden chair over backwards as he scrambled away from the table. That is an absolute lie, Miller shouted, holding his hands up toward the furious judge. He brought me the forged documents. He hired the disgraced doctor. I was completely deceived by my own client. I decided I'd heard enough. I stopped the pathetic, violent trembling in my rough hands. I placed both of my palms flat on the heavy wooden table and pushed myself up. I did not struggle. I did not hunch over. I stood up to my full, intimidating height, pulling my broad shoulders back, letting my chest expand fully. The frail, confused old man completely vanished from the courtroom, replaced instantly by the master carpenter who had built an empire with his bare hands. Jamal looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. He finally understood the massive, inescapable trap he had walked directly into. "You are not sick," Jamal whispered, his voice trembling with pure terror. "I have never been sick a day in my life," said my voice, booming across the silent courtroom, deep and steady as a heavy drum. "But you are sick, Jamal. You are infected with a deep, pathetic greed that makes you believe you are smarter than the very people feeding you. You slept under my roof for 4 long years. You ate my food, you drank my liquor, and you disrespected my home. I gave you every single chance to be a man, but you chose to be a parasite." I turned slightly, looking back at the wooden gallery benches. Brenda was standing up, her hands covering her mouth, heavy tears streaming down her beautiful face. But she was not crying for Jamal anymore. She was crying with relief. She finally saw the absolute truth. "I am so sorry," Brenda Jamal begged, reaching his shaking hands toward her. "Please tell your father to stop this. We are a family." Brenda did not say a word. She simply turned her head away, completely breaking the invisible toxic chain that had tied her to this pathetic thief. "You tried to declare me legally dead," I said, turning my intense focus back to Jamal. "You forged medical records, you hired a disgraced doctor, and you tried to blow up my house, all because you were too much of a coward to face the violent men you stole from. You thought I was just a tired old man playing with wood in the backyard. You did not realize that a man who knows how to build a solid house also knows exactly how to tear one down." Judge Reynolds picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He did not look at the forged paperwork anymore. He looked at the armed deputies standing by the heavy courtroom doors. Bailiff Judge Reynolds ordered, his voice echoing with absolute unforgiving justice. "Take Mr. Carter into immediate custody. I am holding him without bail on massive charges of felony fraud, severe elder abuse, perjury, and reckless endangerment. And detain Mr. Miller as well, pending a full investigation by the State Bar Association." The heavy oak doors swung open again. 3 large uniformed sheriff deputies marched quickly down the center aisle. They grabbed Jamal roughly by his expensive suit jacket, twisting his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of cold steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the massive room. Jamal completely broke down. He sobbed violently, his legs giving out beneath him, forcing the deputies to drag him backward across the polished marble floor. "Andre, please." Jamal screamed, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings as they pulled him toward the hallway. "They are going to kill me in jail. Silas is going to find me. You have to save me, Andre." I stood perfectly still, adjusting the cuffs of my suit jacket. I watched the loud, arrogant man who had tried to steal my entire life get dragged out of the courtroom like a heavy bag of trash. "You are exactly where you belong, Jamal," I said softly, even though he could no longer hear me. Judge Reynolds struck his gavel one final time, the sharp crack signaling the absolute end of the legal slaughter. The courtroom ambush was completely over. The vicious trap had snapped perfectly shut, and the disease was finally removed from my home. 6 months passed, slowly grinding down the days with a brutal, unforgiving weight. The heavy steel doors of the Fulton County Jail slammed shut every single evening, echoing loudly down the long, cold concrete cell block. Jamal Carter wore a faded, oversized orange jumpsuit with a bright white number printed heavily across his back. He was no longer a visionary CEO, and he was no longer a master of the universe. He was just an inmate completely stripped of his fake name, his stolen money, and his arrogant pride. The harsh morning alarm buzzed loudly at 5 o'clock. Jamal rolled over on his thin, hard mattress, his back aching violently from the solid metal frame beneath him. He stood up on the cold floor, splashing freezing water onto his face from the small stainless steel sink. His reflection in the scratched metal mirror was completely unrecognizable. His hair was cut short, his face was gaunt, and his soft, manicured hands were completely ruined. He picked up a heavy, stiff, bristled scrub brush and a bucket of harsh bleach, walking out into the main cell block to begin his daily assigned labor. He was assigned to the sanitation detail, forced to scrub the long row of communal toilets and the grimy shower stalls used by 200 violent men. The smell of the harsh chemicals burned his eyes and stung the deep, raw blisters on his palms. He knelt down on the wet, dirty tile, dipping the heavy brush into the suds, scrubbing the filthy porcelain with all his remaining strength. His muscles burned with exhaustion. This was the exact same menial, back-breaking labor that he used to mock Andre for doing. He remembered standing in the bright Georgia sun, holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch, laughing at the old man working with his hands. He remembered calling honest work a silly hobby. Now honest work was the only thing keeping Jamal from completely losing his mind. He scrubbed the floors until his knuckles bled, wiping his sweating forehead with the sleeve of his orange jumpsuit. The other inmates walked past him, ignoring him completely. He had tried to spin his grand lies in the yard during his first week. He tried to tell the hardened criminals about his massive corporate empire and his luxury cars. They just laughed at him taking his lunch tray and pushing him into the dirt. In a place where only true strength mattered, Jamal had absolutely nothing to offer. The intense, suffocating fear of the loan shark still haunted his nightmares. Silas and his dangerous crew had not been arrested, but they could not reach Jamal inside the maximum security block. He was physically safe from their violent revenge, but he was completely trapped in a tiny concrete cage of his own making. He had no visitors. He had no mail. His sleazy lawyer Miller had been disbarred and was facing his own severe federal charges. Jamal sat alone in the loud, crowded cafeteria, eating a terrible meal of dry bread and watery soup. He stared down at his ruined hands, tracing the deep, permanent calluses forming on his skin. He thought about the massive, beautiful estate on the south side. He thought about the quiet, peaceful workshop and the smell of fresh-cut pine. He had been handed a perfect, comfortable life on a silver platter, but his arrogant, endless greed had demanded more. He wanted the crown without ever doing the work to build the kingdom. He swallowed the dry bread, a single heavy tear sliding down his dirty face. He knew he was going to spend the next 10 years in this horrible place, washing toilets and sleeping on a metal slab. He had completely destroyed his own life, and the heavy, undeniable truth of it all crushed him far worse than any physical prison ever could. Miles away from the cold concrete cell block, the bright golden Georgia sun washed over the south side of Atlanta. The autumn air was crisp and cool, carrying the sweet scent of fallen oak leaves. I stood in my open workshop, the heavy double doors thrown wide to welcome the beautiful morning light. The massive mahogany cabinet was finally finished. I rubbed a soft cotton cloth over the dark wood, working the natural linseed oil deep into the tight, hand-cut dovetail joints. The wood gleamed perfectly strong and deeply rooted, built to last for generations. "Mr. Davis," a quiet voice said from the doorway. I looked up, smiling warmly. Tyrell was standing there holding a heavy push broom. He was 19 years old, a quiet, respectful kid from down the street who had started coming around the shop 3 months ago, asking if he could sweep the sawdust for a few extra dollars. Tyrell did not wear expensive suits, and he did not talk loudly about things he did not understand. He wore heavy canvas work pants, and he listened closely, absorbing every single lesson I taught him about the tools and the wood. "Come on in, Tyrell," I said, setting the cotton cloth down on the workbench. "The floor looks perfect today." Tyrell walked into the shop, leaning the broom carefully against the wall. He looked at the finished mahogany cabinet, his eyes wide with genuine quiet admiration. "That is a beautiful piece of work, Mr. Davis," Tyrell said softly. "You can really see the absolute care put right into the corners. It is all about the foundation." "Tyrell," I said, walking over to my heavy canvas apron, reaching into the deep front pocket. "If you build the foundation right, the rest of the house will stand up to any storm. You've been coming around here for a while now. You work hard, you keep your head down, and you respect the tools." I pulled a thick, heavy manila envelope from my pocket, walking back over to the young man. I held it out to him. "What is this, Mr. Davis?" Tyrell asked, his rough hands hesitating, not wanting to take something he had not earned. "It is a foundation," I said, pressing the heavy envelope directly into his hands. "Open it up." Tyrell opened the metal clasp, slowly sliding out the thick legal documents inside. His eyes scanned the crisp white pages, his jaw dropping open in pure shock. It was the absolute clear legal deed to a small brick commercial building located on the busy South Side Avenue. "Mr. Davis," Tyrell whispered, his voice trembling heavily. "This is a deed to a building. I cannot take this from you. I just sweep the floors." "You are going to do a lot more than sweep floors," I said, placing my heavy hand firmly on his strong shoulder. "You told me you wanted to start your own contracting business, but the banks would not give a young kid a loan. That building is completely paid off, Tyrell. It is yours now. You use it as your headquarters. You build your business the right way with honest sweat, and you never let anyone tell you that working with your hands is a step down." Tyrell looked down at the deed, thick, heavy tears welling up in his eyes. He did not cry like Jamal did with fake, pathetic sobs. He cried with deep, overwhelming gratitude. He reached out, pulling me into a strong, tight hug, burying his face in my shoulder. "Thank you, Mr. Davis," Tyrell said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise you I will never disrespect this gift." "I know you will not," I said, patting his back. "Now get out of here and go look at your new property." Tyrell wiped his eyes, holding the envelope like it was made of solid gold, and ran out of the workshop, his heavy boots sprinting across the damp grass. I watched him go, feeling a profound, absolute peace settling deep into my bones. The wealth I had built was finally doing what it was supposed to do. It was lifting up the people who actually deserved it. A few hours later, a small, reliable sedan pulled into my driveway. Brenda stepped out, wearing a simple, clean uniform for her new job at the local pharmacy. She looked tired, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, but her eyes were completely clear and incredibly bright. She walked around to the backyard, smiling, when she saw me standing by the workbench. "Hey, Dad," Brenda said, walking into the shop and kissing my rough cheek. "How was your shift, sweetheart?" I asked, pouring her a cup of hot coffee from my thermos. "It was long." Brenda laughed softly, taking the warm cup. "My feet hurt and the customers were grumpy today. But my landlord just approved my lease for the new apartment. It is small, Dad. Just a one-bedroom walk-up on the east side, but the rent is cheap and I can pay for it completely by myself." She looked incredibly proud of that small fact. She had walked away from the massive estate, refusing to take a single dollar of my hidden fortune. She wanted to learn how to stand on her own 2 feet and build her own quiet strength completely away from the toxic lies of her past. I am so incredibly proud of you, Brenda, I said, looking at my beautiful, strong daughter. You are building a real life now. She leaned her head against my shoulder, sipping the hot coffee, looking around the peaceful sunlit workshop. I know I am. Dad, Brenda whispered softly in the quiet room. Thank you for showing me exactly what real strength looks like. We stood there together in the warm, golden light, surrounded by the smell of fresh wood and the absolute, unbreakable truth. The heavy storm had finally passed, sweeping away the loud, arrogant trash, leaving only the solid, honest foundation behind. The house was finally quiet. The tools were exactly where they belonged, and everything was perfectly, completely fine. True wealth is not measured by the volume of your boasting, but by the quiet strength of your foundation. Disrespecting the hands that sheltered you will only leave you out in the cold. Justice is a patient builder. It measures twice, and when the time comes, it cuts exactly once.